Michelle Glass here, and welcome back to another episode in our Chapter 18, Lecture 18 series. And our topic for this video are those endocrine glands that we haven't yet mentioned. So we've already talked extensively about both the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. We have actually 3 videos on this. The pituitary gland is, of course, divided into the anterior lobe, or the adenohypophysis, and the posterior lobe, the neurohypophysis. Those glands that we have left to discuss include the thyroid, the parathyroid, the adrenal glands, the pineal gland, and the pancreatic isolates. So let's talk first about the thyroid. The thyroid gland is located over top of the trachea, so in this area here. It is going to be producing those thyroid hormones that you can collectively call thyroxins. So this is like a category or group. And you can abbreviate this as T3 and T4. Now, we've already mentioned that the production of thyroxins requires your dietary iodide. So that would be the ionic form of the iodine. And then the job of thyroxins you can think of as, just real briefly, increasing metabolism of your cells. And it does this by binding to the mitochondria and increasing ATP synthesis, or binding to the nucleus, activating genes for enzymes that are involved in both glycolysis and cellular respiration. So that's, of course, ATP synthesis. Another hormone that is produced here is, of course, calcitonin, which is a hormone that you've talked about already in AMP1 when you were studying your skeleton. The job of calcitonin, remember, is to decrease calcium levels, and it does this by really doing 2 things: stimulating bone growth, so that you're actually putting blood calcium into the bone for storage, and then that's also calcium storage. Okay, next we have the parathyroid gland. Now, the parathyroid gland is anatomically associated with the thyroid. There's 4 located on the back side of the thyroid gland. And the parathyroid gland produces the hormone called parathyroid hormone, which is abbreviated PTH. This is also one you've already studied. This does the opposite action to the calcitonin. So parathyroid hormone is important in increasing your blood calcium levels, and it does this by doing 3 things. So one is to increase your calcium retention at the kidney. So instead of urinating out extra calcium, you're going to retain it by the body. Number 2 is to increase your osteoclast activity. So that's the breaking down of the bone, releasing stored calcium into the blood. And then the 3rd thing is to trigger the release of another hormone called calcitriol, which is going to increase your calcium absorption at the small intestine. So here we're seeing the parathyroid hormone doing the opposite actions of calcitonin, and this should be a review for you from AMP1. Okay, moving on to our next gland. We need to talk about our adrenal glands. We already know that there are 2 of these. They're paired. They're located above each kidney. And we've already talked about the inside of the adrenal gland being called the medulla, and the outside tissue is called the cortex. And you already know that both epinephrine and norepinephrine are hormones released at the medulla. Remember, that's part of the sympathetic nervous system. The adrenal cortex is going to release what are collectively called corticosteroids. So cortico here is referring to the adrenal cortex, and steroids, remember, are lipids. So here are this whole group is an example of lipid-derived hormones. There are 3 important classes of corticosteroids. The first that's listed here are the mineral corticoids, and primarily the one we'll talk about is aldosterone. And remember, I think I already said we'll talk about it again and again and again and again and again and again. Aldosterone is important in retaining sodium. And the key thing here is that essentially wherever sodium goes, water goes with it. So if the body retains sodium, then the body is also going to be ultimately retaining water. So this will be important in increasing your blood pressure and blood volume. Glucocorticoids, we've abbreviated these already as big G, big C, little s. The glucocorticoids are going to be also involved in the glucose-sparing activities that we've already described with growth hormone. Glucocorticoids are going to increase both your glucose and your glycogen synthesis. So the liver can make glucose, it can make glycogen. That glucose then can be released into the bloodstream for your neural tissues, and everything else is going to be using fatty acids. And so your glucocorticoids also tell your adipose tissue to break down triglyceride molecule and release fatty acid. A third activity of the glucocorticoids is anti-inflammatory. So we apply this sometimes. You get a poison ivy rash and you put cortisone. That is a corticosteroid, so that's how it's getting its name there. Okay, and the third big class would be what are called androgens, and these are most important during puberty, but also important in adult females. So androgens are steroids such as testosterone. So we already know testosterone is produced at the testes for males, but here we see some production of androgens happening from the adrenal cortex. Okay, the next gland to mention is our pineal gland. You studied the pineal gland real briefly when you were studying brain anatomy. It is located, remember, sort of at the back of the diencephalon. It is responsible for producing melatonin. Melatonin is maintaining your circadian rhythm, so it's increasing its production in darkness. So sometimes if you're maybe working third shift and you're exposed to artificial light all night and then light, of course, during the day, your circadian rhythms might get disrupted. Or if you're constantly exposed to darkness, such as if you live near the poles and you have those long winter months that are like dusk out, you might have some trouble in your regulation of and production of melatonin. Melatonin also acts as an important antioxidant, which means it's helping to protect neural tissue against free radicals. And then our final discussion here is on the pancreas. Now, the pancreas has both an endocrine and exocrine function, so it's got two different groups of cells. The endocrine cells are collectively called pancreatic isolates. So an isolate is like a tiny island, so you have these small groups of these endocrine cells in that organ that is called the pancreas. Now, you have four different cell types. The first one to discuss here is the alpha cell. The alpha cell is going to produce the glucagon hormone, which is going to increase your blood glucose levels. So glucagon will increase blood glucose levels. Beta cells release the hormone called insulin, which is going to decrease your blood glucose levels. And insulin does this by telling your cells to take the glucose from the blood into the cell and use it for ATP production. So if you've eaten a meal that has carbohydrates, then you're going to have your beta cells releasing insulin. So those carbohydrates, once they are digested and absorbed into the blood, can then move into the cell to be used for ATP production. Notice, sorry about that, two noises. Notice that glucagon and insulin are having the opposite functionalities of each other. So these really are the two most important cell types and also hormones produced by the pancreatic isolates, but they're not the only hormones produced here. We have delta cells making a growth hormone inhibiting hormone. This is just like the GHIH from the hypothalamus, but we actually will see this GHIH decreasing the activity of both the alpha and the beta cells, slowing digestion, and slowing the absorption of nutrients. And then we'll also see pancreatic polypeptide cells making a hormone that's abbreviated as PP, pancreatic polypeptide. So the cells and the hormone have the same name. And this peptide is also important in regulating our digestion, so it's slowing down the absorption of nutrients, it's slowing down gallbladder activity, and it's also helping to regulate some of those pancreatic enzymes. Remember, I said the pancreas has both endocrine and exocrine functions. Its exocrine functions are related to digestion. So we'll talk about the pancreas a lot when we get into that chapter. Again, the two that you really need to know here are glucagon and insulin. Of course, this discussion of sugar can't be complete without also a discussion of diabetes mellitus, which can be either a genetic disorder, or it can be a genetic disorder that's accelerated by obesity, so it is linked with obesity. It can also occur, as a result of injury or an immune disorder or a hormonal imbalance, so there are multiple causes here. There are two types of diabetes mellitus. There's type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is rare. It's just 5% of the population. In this case, individuals are not producing insulin, and it often develops in young children and young adults. It's often been referred to as the juvenile diabetes, but it's not just restricted to children. Type 1 diabetes, if you're not producing insulin, then you have to take the insulin injections in order to get that glucose out of the bloodstream into your cells for use. Type 2 diabetes is when the cells develop what's described as insulin resistance. So the body is producing the insulin that's required, but your cells are not responding to that insulin, so you still have glucose building up in the bloodstream and not being used by the cells. It's the type 2 diabetes that is associated with obesity. Now, because you're insulin resistant in this case and your blood glucose's level is high, then essentially what's happening is cardiovascular problems. Your blood is basically too thick. Think of it as like a maple syrup or honey instead of, which mellitus means honey, so that's a good association. But think of it as honey instead of water in terms of its thickness. Because it's so thick, it has a hard time traveling through the cardiovascular system. And so you see problems in the retina of your eye. This can contribute to early heart attack, peripheral nerve problems. Again, you're not getting the oxygen and the nutrients that these cells need. Overall peripheral tissue damage, and also kidney degeneration, because the kidney is not able to process out the blood the way that it should. Now, your basic treatments for type 2 diabetes would be diet and exercise would be primary, and then if these are not effective enough, then oral medications might be prescribed. And that's it for now.